What's up, dudes and dudes to the internet? My name's Seth and we are back here for another Trove tutorial video, and today we're going to be talking about loot, gear, all that stuff, foraging, and how it all ends up working. Now, for today's video, we're actually going to be on the PC version, while I'm kind of directing this towards console players, just because on the console version, unfortunately, I don't really have any of the endgame gear to show you any of this stuff, but hopefully you still find it helpful regardless, and I would very much appreciate if you would hit that like button, and thank you so much if you do. Now, first of all, as you're out in the world, you're going to be getting different levels of gear, right? Once you pretty much get up to U1 and higher, you're going to be able to get legendary gear, shadow gear, so on and so forth. And even in the earlier portals, you can actually get shadow gear and stuff like that, but it's very rare, even if you end up having max magic find, and it's not recommended anyway. The way that you actually get your magic find so that you can actually get higher quality drops is by having more and more dragons. So the way that you actually get max magic find is by having all of the dragons and then having patron on top of it, right? So what you're really going to be looking for is shadow gear. So that's pretty much the biggest part that goes all the way up to the end game. You can get a shadow 1. It's not called shadow 1, it's just called shadow gear, which makes it a little bit confusing, but whatever. Then there's shadow 2, 3, 4, 5. And then that goes up to Radiant, and then on top of Radiant is Stellar. I'll explain how you actually get that in a moment, but I just want to say that you can actually get all of those as drops depending on your magic find. Last time I checked anyways, I don't know if it's been changed or anything like that, so don't quote me on the numbers, but you had to have, I think, at least 300 magic find in order to get a Radiant drop, and maybe 500 to 700 magic find in order to get a Stellar drop. But honestly speaking, like I said, I don't exactly know. It's not like you can really test it in this game or anything, right? So the forge right here is going to be one of the most essential things to actually getting to the late game, because you're going to end up grinding any of your gear up. Now, if you throw a piece of legendary gear in, you're going to notice that you can put 5 stars into it, which of course is going to end up making it stronger, but then you can't do anything else with it. So it's pretty useless, right? But if you end up having shadow gear, you can actually up that and make it stronger and stronger and reinforce it over and over again, right? So let's just say, for example, you take a shadow 1. You throw it in. This is a Radiant. I'm just going to use it by example. But you throw it in, and then you would get 5 stars. And then that shadow 1 would have the option to turn into a shadow 2. That's going to cost you a couple Eyes of Cthulhu and some flux. And then, once you get 5 stars in the shadow 2, you can forge it up to a shadow 3. Now, this is where things get interesting while also being a little bit tricky. Most people, find this to be very confusing. But honestly, it's not really, there's nothing to it. It's just difficult to explain, I guess, because it's very cluttered. We're going to drop a lot of numbers, right? So in order to forge a shadow 2 up to a shadow 3, you're going to need 2 shadow 2 souls. Now, how do you get shadow 2 souls? By loot collecting shadow 2 gear. So you're going to have to loot collect 2 different pieces of shadow 2 gear on top of having the third one that you want to actually forge up by using those souls, right? So keep that concept in mind, because that applies to shadow 3 to 4, shadow 4 to 5, shadow 5 to Radiant, and then even Radiant to Stellar. So as you can see, it's kind of a perpetual cycle where the resources required are going to get more and more expensive as you end up continuing, right? So even when you get to the Shadow 5, that's where you bump it up to Radiant, which is this piece of gear right here, right? And you're going to end up needing a couple Pentasouls, which means you're going to have to forge a couple pieces of Shadow 5 gear and actually loot collect them on the side, which costs a lot of Shadow 2s if you're doing it from the Shadow 1 or Shadow 2 all the way up. But maybe you get lucky and just find it as a drop, which would be insane for console players. And then it's also going to cost purifying dragon flames. Now, the game doesn't really tell you, but these suckers are actually gotten in the Dragon Crucible right here. That's the only area that you actually use them. They cost primordial flames and radiant shards. And then you're going to forge a shadow 5 up to a radiant. And this is where the stats get really interesting, and you start getting to actually a little bit closer to the end game. And then once you get 5 stars into your radiant, as if that's not already hard enough, then you can forge it into a piece of stellar gear, which stellar is going to look like this. And this is pretty much the end game gear right here. So you can see the stats on it are pretty insane, right? Just for random side gear. Now, The thing, one thing I do want to point out is eventually the late game gear actually becomes useless. I can still, on my character, go into U9 with novice gear and still handle it just fine. Not as efficiently, of course, but I can handle it just fine because of the fact that the gems are where your actual stats are. That's the big thing, right? But stellar gear in itself is actually very annoying because you technically can't grind it. So you're going to actually go into shadow towers. Let me actually hop over to a shadowy merchant right here. So at the shadowy merchant, this is where things get tricky because you're gonna need Titan souls, which you get from completing Spike Walker up to Vengeful Pinata God, and then you're gonna spend your Titan souls for a Shaper Star. And the Shaper Star, you need to have 5,000 power rank in order to actually use this item, right? Because then you're going to end up hopping into the Everdark. The Everdark is only available for U8 and U9, and pretty much the only reason you go to this place is for stellar gear or for your class gem ability, which I've got plenty of tutorials on that already in the description. But we'll just hop into U8 right here just so I can kind of show you what you actually need to do in order to get your Shaper Stars. So once you get into this world, you can, of course, just use the banner to go over to other people. I would recommend doing it in a group, especially if you're not strong enough to actually handle the place yourself. But at the same time, if you can handle it yourself, then definitely fly solo, because otherwise it's just going to take longer and longer and longer based on the amount of people that are around, right? And a couple things that are a little bit annoying about the design of this area and stuff is that there's only ever going to be one entrance here, you know, and then there's going to be the wave machine in the center, and as you activate it, it's going to generate an amount of enemies based on how many players are around, right? So these big ugly golem dudes right here, they're the only enemies that you actually have to defeat. All these other guys are just fluff. They're all just in the way. They're just causing trouble. You can see everybody's actually dying left and right, so I guess that they're not strong enough to handle it just yet. But these guys are the big ones. You need to kill 3 of them and survive for 60 seconds in order to actually get the dungeon completed, right? So now that we got the dungeon completed, we would just use our Shaper Star right here, the same as we would a Shadow Key, and then this chest would open and throw the Shaper Stars automatically in our inventory. Now, if you're going for a class gem, it's the same thing, but it's going to throw it on the ground, so don't like leave it or get disconnected or anything like that, because otherwise that would just suck. Now, while going to the U9 Everdark is technically useless when you're farming for a class gem ability, you know, because the class gem itself is not going to end up being any stronger if you go to U9 or U8, it doesn't really matter, but the Shaper Stars are going to matter. While you're going to end up getting, I think it's 2 out of U8, but out of U9, you're going to end up getting 3, so that adds up very quickly. I think you need 75 Titan Souls, or maybe it's that you need 75 Shaper Stars in order to actually get enough to not only forge a piece of gear to Stellar, but to actually get it all maxed out with 5 stars. And then you end up getting stellar gear. Now, before we end up calling today's video, there is still the Chaos Forge and the Enchanted Forge. So the Chaos Forge, simply put, is going to randomize the third and fourth stat on any piece of gear, right? And the way that the stats actually work in Trove is it's not complicated at all. So for a hat, for example, it's always going to have max health as the first stat. For a face, it's always going to have max health as the first stat, I think. Let me actually double check. Yeah, so those are always going to have max health, and I think the hat is actually one of the only ones that ends up being a little bit different because the way that the stats are going to work is, for example, attack speed. You can get it on the second stat or on the fourth stat. So that's where, as far as gear is concerned, I mean, this is just speed gear because of my Neon Ninja build, right? But if you're like farming for like that perfect set of gear, that's where you may or may not have noticed other players talking about the second stat and how important it is, because for most of the characters in the game, the second stat that you want that's ideal for any piece of gear is crit damage %, right? Because that's just going to give you more hit to your character and everything like that. And it's, you know, it takes a very long time before you can actually rock like movement speed gear or start doing something weirder, right? Now, while sometimes, very rarely, they'll have an event where you can re-roll the second stat, and during those events, if one of them ends up coming up, you're going to want to roll the second stat to the one that you want, and then just wait for the event to end up going away so that you don't have to keep wasting your tentacles to end up rolling this third and fourth stat, right? But that's the thing, is the way that the stats work is the first stat can always only be in the first and third slot. That's why you'll see with the face right here, we can actually get physical damage in the third slot, and on the weapon, physical damage is always going to be at the top, or magic damage depending on the weapon. So energy regen can be the second stat or the fourth stat. Same with movement speed or attack speed being the second and fourth stat. Crit hit, magic find can only end up being on your hat, and then there's a couple other garbled stats that you don't really need, honestly speaking. And where you actually get the Tentacles of Cthulhu is just from the invaders that end up coming around. Like, you'll just be randomly in a world and you'll hear these guys come down from the sky, right? And as you kill them, they have a rare chance of actually dropping a tentacle, or you can end up just getting the tentacle tracked tome and then just complete dungeons and have it give you tentacles repeatedly. Otherwise, honestly speaking, it's a very difficult resource to actually farm. I just kind of have a lot because I'm on the PC version, and it's going to cost a tentacle every time that you want to reroll your stat. Now, the Enchanted Forge, this is where things get a little bit more interesting, but a little bit more confusing at the same time. So, for example, let me just throw this in here. While you actually have the star stats on a piece of gear, there's going to be a Pearl of Wisdom as a separate stat. Now, Pearls of Wisdom used to be a very rare drop from just out in the world. Not exactly sure if that still is the case. I think you might only be able to get these out of Chaos Chests now, but don't quote me on that. You know, the console version is definitely older than the PC version, so hopefully these are still farmable out in the world. There was actually, once upon a time, you could buy these from boat merchants, which was fantastic because, you know, what these end up actually doing is just upping the stats of any of the stats that are already on your piece of gear, right? But, you know, then the devs thought that this item was way too easy to attain considering how helpful it was, and then they kind of just took it in the opposite direction, where now it's insanely hard to get an item that only slightly helps your stats. But anyways, as you end up putting this on your gear, it's going to actually unlock the fourth stat on your piece of equipment, because sometimes as a drop, you can end up only getting 3 stats or 4. And then on top of that, you're going to be able to put 2 pearls into every stat. So it will randomly choose between putting it into the physical, the critical damage, the stability, or the 4th stat. It's always going to generate the 4th stat, and then the pearls are going to just go into these random stats, right? So essentially, if you have a 4-statted weapon already, that's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8 pearls for 1 piece of gear each, just to get the stats out of them, right? Now, this is another thing that lots of people end up overlooking, is the fact that there's these little arrows right here that you can click, right? So this little tome book right here, the Twinkling Tome, I think you can only get that out of the cash shop. Let me double check. Yeah, the Twinkling Tome down here. Now, don't fall for this because this is actually a beginner's trap. Like, I really wouldn't recommend buying it. Same with, I don't know if they have this on the console, but the Radiant pack right here, that is an absolute ripoff. Don't do it. There's a reason that I don't have a video on this pack, because I have nothing good to say about it. But the Twinkling Tomes, don't buy those either because they're kind of a waste. I mean, unless you really, really want to. All these are going to do is end up lowering the level requirement, which is good, you know, especially if a new class ends up coming out on the game and you got like stellar gear. You can actually use enough Twinkling Tomes to get it to be level 1, so you could get the new class and immediately throw all your gear on it. Or not even a new class, but a new class that you just unlocked. So they're useful in that regard, but I personally can't recommend buying them because you get to level 10 soon enough anyway, so you, like, it really doesn't matter. And then there's gonna be the auras. Now, the way that these are going to work is they're just going to take a bunch of your glim, which can end up being very expensive and making you go broke on your glim. But that's what this fire aura is on our character, and these are just for looks. You know, they don't actually change any of the stats in the game or anything like that. And you're going to unlock these based on dragons, mastery, PvP rewards, and stuff like that. And you're going to spend your glim to kind of go through these in linear fashion. You know, the fire is going to go to the ice is going to go to the lightning, and so on and so forth, as long as you end up actually having them all unlocked. I'll just kind of show you a couple of these right here. You can always hide your aura as well, which I definitely like doing. Now, this tough love one right here, and not that one, tough love, and this one right here are actually extremely rare drops from out in the world. And I'm talking I've been grinding this game for such a long time, and I think I've gotten like 1 tough love and 2 shadow stains out of like the 2 years that I've been playing this. Granted, I mean, these drops weren't out 2 years ago, but I'm just saying it's insane. Like, those items are insanely rare. So honestly speaking, I would say unless they're like your favorite auras ever, I would say sell them, because you're gonna make bank off of those, dude. Like, seriously. But like I said, most of these you gain like from PvP or just from having them unlocked from dragons that you actually get. This one right here, the Whispers of Chaos, is actually very rarely dropped out of the Chaos chest, so good luck with that one. Now, on top of that, you may have seen some people with it, but you're not really going to. While the weapon aura, you only need radiant gear, the helmet is going to end up getting an aura once it gets to stellar. So that's where, you know, if you really, really want a piece of, you know, like something to glow on your character's head, I would recommend going for the stellar hat first above like getting a weapon. Personally, I would say go for the weapon because it's going to make an overall difference to your character's damage and stuff like that. But if you just want it for style, then just go for the hat first because it's the only one that's going to be noticeable, right? This is going to be the starting default one, and then all these other auras are stupid to actually grind up because they are all, except for this one right here, all of the auras are a very rare drop out of empowered gem boxes, which technically you can't grind because you can only get an empowered gem box per lunar soul, which is for defeating Daughter of the Moon per week. So, you know, I've opened over 400 empowered gem boxes on the PC, and I still haven't gotten my last aura, which is the fire aura. Now, this one right here, I'll openly say you have to actually buy one of the gem booster packs. The $100 one will actually get you this aura, which, I mean, that's pretty insane. It's definitely one of the coolest auras, and it's been a long time since they've added any new ones, but still, it's pretty nuts. And that's essentially it, folks. So I hope you found this video helpful. One last thing that I do want to mention is that if you're trying to gear farm, I would recommend selling maybe the Shadow 5, maybe the Radiant Soul if you can spare it when you actually loot collect those pieces of gear. But honestly speaking, it's not really going to be that profitable, especially at first, especially on the console, because the community is like so new and stuff like that, right? But you can end up selling the souls, you know, it's probably going to end up making you quite a bit of flux, but honestly speaking, there are easier ways of making flux. But I hope you found this video helpful with all of the gear and everything like that. So thanks so much for watching, very much appreciate it. Don't forget to like, share, favorite, and subscribe for more daily content. If you do have any other questions, leave them in the comments below. I'm sure somebody will answer, if not myself. Sign on, stay epic, everybody.